Good afternoon, class. Today we're going to talk about the rise of Rome, but first we need to know a little bit about the geography of Italy. Italy is a peninsula. As you can see here, it is surrounded by water on three sides, and they also call it the boot because it kind of resembles a boot. Now, Italy is kind of unique, being that it has the Apennine Mountains. If you could see, I'm sorry for that. Let me put the pen. If you could see right here, these are the mountains, okay? Rome is right here, again with the pen. This is new software, guys, so I'm trying to get used to it. This is Rome right there. Okay, there's a lot of fertile land. When there's fertile land means that they could have crops, they could do agriculture. So the more food there is, the larger the population. And Italy was important because it was the crossroads between the Mediterranean, this is the Mediterranean Sea, and northern Africa, which is here. But it had roads that would connect to Asia Minor, Turkey, and this is Turkey right over here, and this is Western Europe right up here. These are the French Alps up here. Up here is where you have your French Alps right there. So Italy was kind of protected. It was protected by water on three sides and the French Alps, which were up here. Okay, like I said, Rome is right here, and this right here would be your Tiber River. Okay, now Rome was very well protected because up around Rome there were seven hills. So Rome was actually built on the hills. So to protect them from attack, it's very difficult to attack uphill. Okay, now this is the region where Rome grew. It was populated by three different types of people: the Etruscans, which are here in green, the Greek, which were here in purple, and of course the Romans, who are here in red. This is all of Italy, and like you can see right here, that's the Tiber River. This is North Africa, this is Greece, and this is Asia Minor, which is Turkey. Okay? Now we're going to talk a lot about the people. Like I mentioned earlier, it was three types of people. The Romans, which we're going to say, let's say the Latins, which were Indo-European groups that moved into Italy. They spoke Latin. They were mainly herders and farmers. And the Greeks, which we already talked about, they settled in the northern part of Italy, and they greatly influenced Rome. Remember, the Romans borrowed their alphabet from the Greek, and the Greek the Phoenicians. So we have the Roman alphabet, okay? But Greece already was very advanced. So we borrowed from their language, their art, their architecture, their literature, and their love of poetry, and of course the mythology of the gods. The Etruscans were from the north, like I mentioned earlier, and they came into Rome and they transformed it from village to city. The Etruscans were very much city planners. They were the most influential on the culture of Rome, being that they were a little bit more advanced than your average Roman, and they were very advanced and skilled in the art of warfare. So that helped Rome have its powerful military that eventually it did have. Okay, now the Roman Republic. Republic means it has a government that has people who represent it. Okay, for instance, say our classroom, we're going to vote on something and someone has to go to the office. It's very difficult for every single student at VMT to go to the office, so we pick a representative from each classroom to go and speak for us. So that would be a form of republic government. Okay, so the Romans, they eventually overthrew the Etruscan kings, which were the dominant group. And then for about 200 years, the Romans were in continuous warfare with other tribes and peoples around the area. Okay? Now, people who joined them and they were able to conquer were granted full citizenship of the conquered peoples, or they were made allies of the remaining communities. Okay, and people were allowed to remain free on their own affairs, and as long as you stayed part of the Roman Republic, you were allowed citizenship in the First Republic of Rome, which we're going to talk about is going to transition into several periods, okay? Um, the next slide, it's the political structure. We actually get our political ideas and structure from the Romans. If you take a government class, they're going to tell you that we invented the separation of powers, which in actuality, the Romans had a system that divided the powers between two groups. which the patricians were your rich people and your plebeians. But I'll show you on Monday, the structure was it had a council, which was two people, then it had a senate, and then you had praetors who were like the Supreme Court who make sure that the law was obeyed. This was actually the first example of a democratic republican government, which the United States now has. Okay? Now, the Roman law was very unique, but remember, it wasn't the first. Hammurabi's code of law was the first recorded law in history. The Romans had something called the 12 Tables, which was Rome's first code of laws. Okay, they had laws of nation, universal laws based on reason. Remember, reason is the part of understanding why things happen and understanding the truth, which is where philosophy comes in. Now, they also believed in justice for all the people. Example, the innocent until proven guilty, right to a trial, which we now practice in the United States. In the United States, you are innocent until proven guilty. And some other countries, for example, Mexico, you're guilty and then you have to prove yourself innocent. Well, in the United States, we practice something that we adopted from the Romans, which even if someone witnesses you committing a crime, you could still say you're innocent, and then you argue the case as it could be self-defense, temporary insanity, or misidentification. There are several things you can do. So the Romans were just like the Greeks, but they became very powerful and very organized. But remember, they had something to work with. They grew into a republic that had ideas from other people. For example, the Greeks had already lived it, done that. So they had a lot of advice from people who eventually, after several generations of living in Italy, were proud Romans. Okay? Now, Rome eventually, they started getting very powerful and they started to expand, just like all the empires we've been talking about, the Greek empires, Alexander the Great, which we didn't really get into detail, but we could, as long as we catch up, I could go into Alexander the Great. Uh, Romans wars were called the Punic Wars, which was Rome against Carthage, which is here in brown. If you could see, the Carthage Empire is pretty powerful. Um, so Rome eventually, initially, had a little battle with Carthage. They won, but Carthage forever remained their enemy, and they vowed to seek revenge on Rome, which they did. Okay? Now, the next slide is going to have the expansion. After the Second Punic Wars, Hannibal, which was led by Hannibal, he was a person from Carthage. If you could see here, he invaded through North Africa and came in through the Alps with elephants. The Romans had never seen elephants before. 46,000 men and horses, elephants, etc. But if you remember up here, I told you that this is where the Alps are. So half of those men, elephants, and animals perished before they got to Rome. Okay? So at the Battle of Cannae, Carthaginian victory, which means the Romans, and the Battle of Zama, which was the big Roman victory, was when Rome overthrew Hannibal, which he had to retreat because when he was fighting up here, sorry about that again. This is new software, guys. When they were fighting up here, Rome invaded from here into Carthage, while the majority of Carthage army was over here, up here where you see this area. So they invaded Carthage. Hannibal was forced to leave Italy, and then Scipio, who was the Roman general at that time, he crushed Hannibal, ending the Punic Wars. But remember, they remained enemies forever. Until eventually this area became other countries. Like, for instance, right now, this is Morocco. Then you have Libya, Sudan. Of course, here you have Egypt. Okay? Now, the next slide, which we're going to see, is on the Roman expansion, which was the Third Punic Wars. Like I said, they remained enemies and they kept fighting. So in the Third Punic Wars, Cato called for the complete destruction of Carthage. They actually were able to destroy much of Carthage, and they took over 50,000 men, women, and children into slavery. And it eventually, Carthage became a Roman province. A province is the same thing as a state, but they call it province. For instance, if you go to Europe or you go to Canada, you're not going to see states, but you will see provinces which actually act in the same way. They're just like states, okay? So eventually, Carthage became a Roman province of Africa. I'm sorry, a Roman province in Africa. And then Rome also defeated the Hellenist states in the east. Eventually, they started growing into a big, huge empire. And we're next going to talk about how the Judaism, which we talked earlier when the semester began, has influence in Rome, and then eventually the decline of the Roman Empire. And you're going to learn something that all empires eventually get so big that they're too hard to manage, hence they collapse. Okay, so make sure to be ready for the quiz. The quiz will be tomorrow. It would be ready for you to use by 4 or 5 p.m. the latest. So do not forget that, okay? Again, have a nice weekend. I'll see you Monday. Sign off.